I was running on fumes by the time I pulled into the driveway. The hum of my old Tacoma's engine sputtered to a halt, and I let my head rest against the steering wheel for a moment longer than necessary. Another 16-hour day on site. My boots were caked in red clay from Cypress Heights' latest commercial build. My back screamed, and all I wanted was a hot shower, a cold beer, and silence. But before I even stepped out, my eyes landed on it, tilted slightly in the yard like it had sprouted there overnight, smug as hell. Sold. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe one of the neighbors had moved and the realtor got lazy with sign placement. I stepped out, walked up the drive with my heart hammering faster than it should have been, and stared at the sign like I could will it to say something else. But it didn't move. It stayed right there, in the middle of my manicured front lawn. My front lawn. The house I'd picked out when I was 23, scraping together every dime I'd saved since college. I paid the mortgage. I planted those hedges. Hell, I built the damn porch swing with my own hands. A pit opened in my stomach. I didn't even use my key. I just pushed through the front door and stumbled into what used to be mine. The air inside was lavender and lemon, too soft, too polished, like someone had tried to erase any trace of me. The furniture was gone, the rugs rolled up, the walls stripped of my framed sketches. In the center of the living room stood Meredith Voss, rolling a champagne-colored suitcase behind her like she was boarding a yacht. She turned and smiled like I'd just caught her trying on sunglasses, not casually dismantling my life. "Oh, Caleb," she said, that high-gloss tone she always used when pretending we were friendly. "You're home early." I just stood there, blinking, trying to make the pieces fit. "What's going on?" I finally managed. "Why is there a sold sign in my yard?" Meredith hummed lightly, brushing invisible lint from her silk blouse. "Oh, that. Yes. Well, it all happened rather quickly. But don't worry, everything's sorted." "Sorted?" I choked out. "This is my house." She laughed. "Caleb, really? You don't need a luxury home at your age. You're a bachelor. It's excessive." I felt my body freeze, and for a second I couldn't tell if I was going to throw up or punch a wall. "What the hell did you do?" "I sold the house, sweetheart," she said, like she was explaining bedtime to a toddler. "Honestly, you should thank me. The market's peaking, and I got a phenomenal offer. Cash. It'll help you downsize, get practical. Maybe find a nice apartment near the site, right? You sold it." I took a step toward her, the words barely pushing past my teeth. "You can't sell what doesn't belong to you." Meredith just wheeled her suitcase past me, her heels clicking on the hardwood like punctuation marks. "Oh, I think you'll find I can. Everything's been handled, Caleb. You don't need to get all emotional." "All emotional?" I barked. "This is my home. Mine. Not yours, not my mom's. Mine." She didn't even pause. She glided toward the door like she was late for a gala. "Don't be dramatic. You'll bounce back. It builds character." I stared at the spot where my coffee table used to be. The spot where I'd once fallen asleep after a 20-hour shift, blueprint still in my lap, dreaming of the future I was building here. In this house. That was supposed to be my foundation. "Where's Mom?" I asked, voice shaking. "Does she know about this?" Meredith gave a slow, deliberate smile. "She's traveling. You know how she is. Hard to reach." Then, as if remembering something minor, she added, "Anyway, I'm due in Milan. Europe awaits." She gave me a final once-over, her eyes barely hiding their disdain. "Try not to take it personally, Caleb. It's all for the best." The door clicked behind her, and I stood there in the shell of my home, my fists clenched, my throat tight. The silence was deafening. She didn't just steal a house. She cracked something deeper, something I didn't even know was fragile. And somewhere deep inside, past the disbelief, the betrayal, and the ache, I felt it start. A fire. Cold, steady, and impossible to ignore. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't even take off my boots. I just stood there in the middle of my gutted living room, staring at the spot where my dad's old leather recliner used to sit, where I used to sit, back when I still thought things made sense. The morning light filtered through the windows like nothing was wrong, like the whole damn world hadn't shifted on its axis while I was off laying concrete and calculating load-bearing tolerances for someone else's skyscraper. I finally pulled out my phone, hands trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. I dialed my mom. June. The woman who raised me, kissed scraped knees, framed my high school diploma, cried when I got my engineering license. She'd have answers. She had to. Voicemail. I tried again. Then again. Then again. Hi, you've reached June Monroe. I'm probably off traveling somewhere beautiful. Leave a message, and I'll get back to you. Every time her voice came on, that chirpy, carefree tone she'd started using more often after marrying Meredith, it hit me like a slap. I left messages, calm ones at first, then a little more urgent, then finally just raw confusion and fury spilled through my clenched jaw. Mom, call me. Please. I need to talk to you right now. Something's wrong. But she didn't call. Around 9 that morning, a glossy black town car rolled up to the curb like it had arrived for royalty. Meredith stepped out of the house like she was leaving a spa retreat, not the scene of a crime. Hair perfectly curled, oversized sunglasses on, lips painted like she hadn't just torched someone's life. She gave me a brief nod, then handed the driver her suitcase. I walked out onto the porch, jaw tight, chest burning. You can't just leave after what you did. This isn't over. She tilted her head like she was examining a stray dog. You're still here, she said, almost amused. You sold my house. She sighed, brushing invisible lint from her tailored blazer. Caleb, again, you're being dramatic. The house was family property. Your mother and I had every right to make a decision in the best interest of the family. No, I snapped, stepping off the porch. That's not how this works. I paid for that house. My name's on the mortgage. Her lips curled. Things change. Don't you think it's time you let go of this idea that everything's yours? Honestly, you've always been so attached. I lived there, I said, low and sharp. I built my life there. You had no right. She turned toward the car, her smile widening. Relax. It's all for the best. Maybe this will push you to grow up. Get a fresh start. You're 28, plenty of time to start over. Start over from what? I demanded. From the theft you committed? But Meredith was already sliding into the back seat. The door shut with a thud, sealing her in like some kind of bulletproof fantasy, and I was left standing in the driveway, fist balled, teeth grinding. The car eased away without so much as a glance back. I turned toward the house, what used to be my house, and for the first time, I really saw it for what it was now. Empty. Cold. Hollowed out like someone had reached in and scooped out everything that made it mine. The walls still stood, but the soul of the place had been ripped away and sold for parts. It was no longer a home. It was a monument to betrayal. My phone buzzed in my hand. I snatched it up like it might be June calling back. Voicemail again. That's when it sank in. I might not even own it anymore. It wasn't just a bad dream or some technical mix-up. I didn't have keys to a house. I didn't have claim to a home. All I had was a pickup truck full of dirty work gear and a title that might have never meant anything at all. I stepped back into the house, but it felt wrong now, like trespassing. The light felt too bright, the echo of my boots too sharp. Meredith had gutted more than the rooms. She'd gutted my security, my foundation, the very thing I thought couldn't be taken away. There was a buzzing in my ears, the beginning of something darker uncoiling beneath my skin. I sat on the floor where my couch used to be and stared out the window. I could still see the faint imprint of my old grill on the back patio, the one I used for cookouts with coworkers after we wrapped projects. The laughter, the beer, the plans for expansions gone. Vaporized. I wasn't sure what was worse, what she'd done, or how easy it had been for her to do it. But one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore this. I couldn't just let her walk off into the European sun with my future packed in her designer luggage. No more voicemails. No more waiting. I needed to find out how this happened, how she could do it without me knowing. And more than that, I needed to take it back. If she thought this was the end of the story, she had no idea who she was dealing with. The next morning started with a headache and a question that wouldn't leave my mind. How? How could she have done it? How could someone just swoop in and erase years of my life like I was a ghost? I'd poured everything I had into that house. It wasn't just a place to sleep. It was my proof that I'd made it. My symbol that hard work actually meant something. I sat hunched over the cheap kitchen table in my temporary apartment, if you could even call the cracked linoleum and dusty windows a kitchen, and flipped through the worn manila folder where I kept all my property documents. I'd pulled it out of my truck the night before, after leaving what used to be my house. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, exactly. Maybe a receipt of ownership, something stamped in big, bold ink that said Caleb Monroe owns this damn house. Instead, I found complexity. Mortgage forms. Initials. Copies of loan agreements with so many pages I felt like I was drowning in them. But then, halfway through the mess, I saw it, her name. Meredith Voss. Scrawled in signature on a refinance document dated almost a year ago. My blood ran cold. What the hell was she doing on that? I flipped back to the original documents from when I bought the house. There it was, my signature, my down payment confirmation, and there, my mother's name as co-signer. I had been 23, fresh into my first full-time role, still building credit. The bank had required a co-signer, and June had agreed, proudly even. I remembered her saying, "It's just to get you started, sweetheart. This is your place." But 5 years later, that kindness had turned into a liability. While I'd been in Nevada for 9 months working on a commercial tower build, Meredith had quietly crept in. A refinance had taken place. Somehow, the loan was restructured in her name alone. My name? Gone. I stared at the page like it was mocking me. According to this, the new deed excluded me completely. And what really burned, my signature was on this new document too. Except it wasn't. I stared at it, scanning every line of ink, every loop and curve. It was close enough to pass a glance, but I knew my own handwriting. That C was too narrow, the tail on the B was wrong, and whoever faked it had misspelled my middle name, flipping the E into an Alexander. She forged my signature. I sat back, the folder slipping from my hands onto the table. My heart was pounding in my ears. This wasn't just betrayal. This was criminal. Meredith had erased me from my own life with a pin and a lie, and no one had stopped her. No one even asked questions. Not the bank, not the notary, not the real estate agent. Because I hadn't been there. I thought about that project in Nevada. 10 months of grueling work, long nights, unpaid overtime, and cheap motel dinners. I'd taken the job to fast-track a promotion. I thought I was building something bigger. And while I was gone, she'd taken the one thing I actually had built. That house. I pushed back from the table, blood simmering. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was activated. I wasn't going to play nice. I wasn't going to beg or plead. I was going to prove what she'd done and make sure she never got away with it. But I needed help. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in months, Miles Herrera. We'd gone to undergrad together, back when I was obsessed with steel frames and he was buried in law textbooks. He specialized in property law now and had a mind like a bear trap. He picked up on the second ring. Caleb? Damn, man, it's been a minute. Yeah, I said, voice hoarse. Listen, I need to ask you something. It's serious. By the time I finished explaining everything, there was a pause so long I thought the call dropped. Tell me you have the documents, he finally said. I've got the originals, I replied, and the refinance copies. The signature on the new deed isn't mine. Then we've got a problem, he said. For her. This is textbook mortgage fraud if it's forged. You could have a civil and criminal case. I exhaled hard. Finally, something that wasn't just confusion or helpless rage. A path. A step forward. She did it while I was working out of state, I said. Slipped in while I wasn't looking. Miles muttered, that's not just shady. That's surgical. I sat there, gripping the phone. I still locked on the folder spread across my table. My hands weren't trembling anymore. Let's bring it down on her, I said quietly. He paused again. Then, send me everything. I'll start reviewing it tonight. I hung up and stood slowly, the weight of the last 2 days finally forming into something tangible. There was still wreckage, still loss, but underneath it all, there was now a seed of something sharper. This wasn't just about getting my house back. It was about tearing down whatever illusion Meredith had built and showing her that I wasn't some passive kid she could outmaneuver. She wanted to rewrite history? Fine. But now I was the one holding the pen. The first thing I did was check my bank accounts. Not the ones I used daily. Those were fine, as untouched as they'd been since payday. I was looking for the one connected to the house. The one where my mortgage payments used to come from. The one that was supposed to receive any sale proceeds, should they ever exist. The balance read, $82.44. That couldn't be right. I blinked and refreshed. Same result. I scrolled through the transaction history with growing disbelief. One large deposit hit the account exactly 3 weeks ago, $487,000, marked as property sale, Cypress Heights residence. And from there, it was like watching blood drain from a wound. $10,000 here to something labeled Velvet Retreats, Lake Como. Another $12,000 to Mila Couture, Milan. $5,000 to a travel agency in Geneva. And the rest? A steady, almost methodical stream of transfers to overseas banks, Zurich, Luxembourg, and one tagged only with a string of numbers and a cryptic abbreviation I didn't even recognize. The house had sold. I hadn't seen a dime. Not 1 cent. I sat back in the creaky apartment chair, the thin plastic armrests digging into my elbows as my brain tried to catch up. She hadn't just stolen my house. She'd stolen nearly $500,000 from under my name, from under my life, and spent it on spa packages and designer luggage. My jaw clenched hard enough to ache. She played this like a symphony. The timing, the fake signature, the refinance, the silent sale, all of it orchestrated while I was across the country, too buried in work to notice the ground shifting beneath my feet. And the worst part? She knew exactly what she was doing. I imagined her in Lake Como, lounging by a heated infinity pool, a glass of champagne in hand, probably telling some bored stranger how she was finally rid of the dead weight back home. I could almost hear her voice, that syrupy tone she used to mask her venom. Caleb's a sweet boy, but he doesn't know how to manage what he's been given. He needed a push. No, what I needed was justice. I didn't scream. I didn't punch the wall, though God knows I wanted to. No, I sat there in the silence of that apartment, the smell of someone else's cooking seeping in through the thin walls, and I started writing. A plan. A clear, structured, calculated plan. Step 1 had already started with Miles. He was digging into the fraud. But that wouldn't be enough, not if she'd tucked away the cash overseas. I needed someone who knew how to follow the money. Someone who could make sense of the tangled net Meredith had spun behind her glossy, Instagram-worthy lifestyle. So I called Reed, my late father's brother. Reed Lawson, accountant, financial analyst, and the kind of guy who wore suspicion like cologne. He'd never liked Meredith. Said she smiled with her teeth, not her eyes. He kept his distance after Dad passed, but he always checked in around the holidays, and I knew if anyone would want to help unravel this mess, it'd be him. He picked up on the second ring. Caleb. Hey, Uncle Reed. I need your help. He listened as I explained everything. Every detail. The forged signature. The refinance. The sale. The missing money. By the end, I could hear his breathing shift, that quiet burn in his chest igniting the way it always did when something didn't sit right. She didn't just rob you, he finally said. She robbed your father's legacy. I swallowed hard. Can you trace it? I can try. If she moved it through Swiss accounts, it won't be simple, but nothing's truly hidden forever. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I need to bring her down, Reed. Not just get the money back. I need to make sure she never does this to anyone else. There was a pause. Then his voice, steady and sure. Let's burn her paper trail to ash. By nightfall, I'd scanned every document I had and sent them to both Reed and Miles. The group chat we created was cold and efficient. Updates, receipts, transactions. Miles was already drafting preliminary legal claims. Reed was compiling a financial map of Meredith's empire. And me? I got to work cleaning up my life. I shredded old paperwork, deleted every voicemail from my mother, packed what few things I had into labeled boxes. The grief hadn't hit me yet. Not really. There wasn't room for it. My hands were too busy, my mind too sharp. All I could think about was the betrayal and the trail it left behind. Every time I tried to remember my mom's voice, all I could hear was Meredith's laugh echoing in its place. I wasn't her son anymore. I was her loose end. But the mistake she made, the one she'd regret more than anything, was thinking I'd just roll over and disappear. I was a builder. I understood foundations. I knew how to demolish what was weak and start again, stronger, smarter. She built her life on fraud. I was going to bring it down, brick by brick. When I woke up the next morning, the anger was still there, but it had cooled into something more precise. It was no longer fire, it was steel. Sharper, heavier, unbreakable. The helplessness had passed. Now came the part one was good at. The rebuild. I'd spent years solving structural failures on high-rise sites. If a beam cracked, I didn't panic. I found the stress point and reinforced it. This was no different. The stress point was Meredith. I just had to dismantle her framework one bolt at a time. First, I called Miles. I've got everything you sent, he said, voice clipped and focused. This isn't just shady, Caleb. It's criminal. Forging your signature on a refinance is felony-level mortgage fraud, especially if the property was later sold. What are we looking at? I asked, pacing my tiny apartment floor. Best case? A civil suit and restitution. Worst case, for her? Prison. But we need to move fast. If she's funneled that cash into offshore accounts, it's going to be harder to track the longer we wait. She's not just funneling, I said. She's flaunting. I told him about the transactions I'd traced. Designer boutiques, private resorts, and a car service in Monaco. She wasn't even trying to hide the fact that she was spending money that didn't belong to her. She's arrogant, Miles muttered. Good. That makes her sloppy. Next, I called Reed. He didn't waste time with small talk. I've started digging into her financials. You were right. There's more here than a shady refinance. She has off-the-books rental income, ghost LLCs, and her tax filings don't match her reported income. It's not just you she's been robbing. My chest tightened. How long has this been going on? Years, if I had to guess, he said. But the house was her biggest score. Your name made it possible. She leveraged your absence and your mother's trust to line her pockets. I leaned against the wall, letting the weight of it all settle. You think there's enough for a federal case? I think she's got more skeletons than closet space, he replied. And if we play this right, we don't just sue her, we ruin her entire illusion. I was silent for a moment. The image of Meredith strutting through some cobblestone street in Paris, oblivious to the web unraveling behind her, filled my head. For once, I didn't feel helpless. I felt like I was standing on bedrock again. I want to start with freezing her accounts, I said. Can we do that? Miles chimed in later that afternoon, confirming the next steps. He had already filed an emergency injunction with the county clerk's office to halt any further transfers on the sale. The forged signature was enough to trigger legal scrutiny, and with Reed's help, we submitted a formal complaint to the IRS, backed with evidence of undeclared income and falsified tax returns. While they worked the legal angles, I handled something else, public perception. I wasn't one to air dirty laundry, but Meredith built her reputation on optics. She belonged to a dozen social clubs, fancy luncheons, philanthropic galas. Her life was curated, edited, and polished to the point of parody. I knew exactly how to chip away at that mask. I posted a carefully worded message on a local homeowner forum, one that Meredith often bragged about dominating with her elegant influence. I didn't use her name. Just a vague but pointed story about a young professional who'd had his home sold out from under him by a family member through forged documents. The responses poured in. Sympathy. Outrage. A few private messages with similar horror stories, some even naming her. The cracks were forming. By the end of the week, I got word from Reed. I found an unreported income stream. A property in Charleston she's been renting through a proxy for years. Never declared it. She's been hiding cash and fake maintenance expenses and funneling the rest into a consulting firm she registered to a P.O. box. I smiled for the first time in days. So she's been stealing and laundering. Precisely, Reed said. And that's just the beginning. The IRS had officially opened a case, and Miles filed a civil suit against her with me as the primary plaintiff. Fraud, misrepresentation, theft, the whole 9 yards. And still, as all of this moved forward, she had no idea. Meredith was in Paris, according to her most recent Instagram post, standing on a balcony with a flute of champagne and a caption that read, "Let them eat cake." Fitting. I forwarded the post to Miles and Reed. Reed didn't even respond. Miles texted back, "She's going to choke on it." I spent that night clearing out my email inbox, deleting the remnants of happier times. Birthday reminders from June. Old mortgage payment receipts. Automated alerts from the security system I no longer owned. It stung, sure, but I wasn't drowning anymore. I was laying the groundwork. Every system she exploited, every step she took in those Louboutin heels, every lie she told to dress up her greed, it was all catching up to her. And I wasn't going to stop until the whole thing collapsed beneath her. She wanted to play the long game? She should have remembered that engineers think in blueprints. And mine always start with demolition. The moment Miles confirmed what I already suspected, something in me settled. Not like relief, more like a click, a puzzle piece snapping into place with finality. He'd just gotten off the call with the county clerk's office. After comparing the refinance documents I'd provided with verified samples of my actual signature, the forgery was undeniable. "It's not even close," he said. "It wouldn't pass a high school art class." That one forged signature had triggered a chain reaction. The sale of my house was now under official dispute. The new owners were being notified, and Meredith, blissfully unaware from her penthouse suite in Europe, was about to be served with a storm she never saw coming. Meanwhile, Reed had gone full bloodhound on her finances. He didn't just find the Charleston rental. He found 4 other properties under various shell LLCs, all rented through third parties and generating undeclared income for years. They were each tied to Meredith through the most paper-thin disguises, duplicate email addresses, tax IDs off by a digit, business addresses that redirected to her interior designer's office. Sloppy, and arrogant. She was hiding in plain sight, Reed told me, his voice low with disgust. Every time she filed a return, she committed perjury. And that little consulting firm? It doesn't even have a website. Just exists to funnel money from property management fees to a Swiss account. And the tax forms? I asked. Falsified, he replied. She's been underreporting income for 5 years. It's enough to warrant a full audit. I've already submitted everything to the IRS Office of Fraud Detection. I sat back, slowly exhaling. She'd spent years building her fake empire on silk sheets and stolen foundations. But the moment someone lifted the corner of that silk, it all unraveled. The next domino fell when Miles filed a motion for an injunction to freeze all her assets. The evidence we provided, fraudulent signatures, forged notary stamps, missing funds, was enough for a judge to approve it immediately. All of Meredith's U.S. accounts were now legally frozen. If she tried to move money, she'd be blocked. If she tried to sell more properties, she'd be stopped. She didn't know it yet, but the walls were closing in. And then the real blow landed. It was a Thursday afternoon when I got the call from Reed. She's triggered the IRS audit, he said. They've opened an investigation into tax evasion and international wire fraud. This isn't just a slap on the wrist, Caleb. This is federal. I didn't speak for a moment. I stared out the window of my apartment at the distant skyline I helped design. Steel bones, rising from the earth. Not glamorous. Not flashy. Just solid. She's going to lose everything, isn't she? I asked quietly. She already has, Reed said. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, there was nothing left to worry about. No, I was wide awake because for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. The anger that had sat in my chest like a tumor was being surgically removed, piece by piece. Meredith had spent years taking from me my house, my money, my stability, and worst of all, my trust in the people I thought were supposed to protect me. But now I had something back she could never buy. Power. At 3 in the morning, I scrolled through her latest Instagram photo. She was in Venice now, captioned, sailing into serenity. Let peace be the currency of the soul. She wore a silk robe, holding a mimosa. The comments were filled with heart emojis, admiration, women calling her an icon. I wondered how many of them knew they were admiring a felon in real time. I took a screenshot and sent it to Miles and Reed. Tick, tick, I typed. The next morning, I got confirmation that the civil lawsuit had been accepted by the court. She'd be served within the week, assuming we could reach her between hotel check-ins and luxury boutiques. Miles had already alerted her banks. The federal investigators had sent notice to her known business addresses. She might be across the ocean, but the storm was international now. That same day, I drove past my old house. It had been quiet since the sale. The new buyers were in limbo, caught in the legal mess Meredith left behind. Their U-Haul sat parked awkwardly in the driveway, still half full. I almost felt bad for them. Almost. As I sat there, a thought struck me, not of revenge, not of anger, but of clarity. This wasn't just about what was taken. It was about what I had learned. I'd always thought strength came from keeping your head down and pushing through. But I was wrong. Real strength came from standing up, calling things what they were, and refusing to be silenced by entitlement disguised as family. Meredith had counted on my silence, my shock, my passivity. But she forgot one thing. I build things. And I just finished building her downfall. Greystone International Airport looked the same as it always did, gray, glassy, and soulless. I stood behind a tinted window across from the arrival gate, tucked out of view near a coffee kiosk, arms folded, hood up. My heart wasn't pounding. It was quiet, steady, focused. After everything she'd taken, everything she'd lied about, I thought seeing her again would boil my blood. But it didn't. What I felt wasn't rage, it was satisfaction. Like watching the final piece slide into place on a long, slow collapse. Her flight from Paris landed right on schedule. First class, of course. No delays, no idea that her kingdom had fallen while she was sipping cocktails under vaulted ceilings and velvet lounges. I watched the stream of passengers pour out, and then there she was, Meredith Voss, stepping off the plane in stilettos and designer sunglasses like she was returning from a diplomatic summit, not walking into the jaws of ruin. She looked fresh off a photo shoot. Long cream-colored coat, soft cashmere draped over her shoulders, wheeled luggage that probably cost more than my first car. She moved like she owned the air around her, head high, smile just starting to form as if she expected someone to greet her with flowers and applause. Instead, she got locked out of her own fantasy. I watched from a distance as her driver, one she didn't know had been cut off at the accounts, never arrived. She tapped her phone, frowned, then called someone. Probably her assistant. Too bad they were also unreachable, their contract frozen with her funds. She started walking, head tilted in mild confusion, wheeling her suitcase toward the parking garage like she'd sorted all out with a single phone call. But the world no longer bent for Meredith Voss. I left before she saw me. I didn't need to gloat. Watching the cracks form in her pristine armor from afar was enough. Later that afternoon, she arrived at the house. My house. Well, what used to be my house. I got the call from Miles just as she rolled up. He'd installed a temporary security team to monitor the property once the new buyers backed out. Legally, the sale was null until ownership could be rightfully reestablished. Meredith, unaware of any of that, pulled up in her champagne-colored SUV, climbed out in heels far too tall for the gravel driveway, and marched right up to the front gate. It didn't open. She tapped the access code panel. Nothing. Tried again. Still nothing. That's when the panic started to crack through her polished exterior. According to Miles, she started ringing the call box, pacing like a cornered cat. Within minutes, June arrived in her silver sedan, tires crunching to a stop in the driveway like she'd been called to extinguish a fire. I watched it all through the security feed Miles had patched into my laptop. June stepped out, a mess of nerves, eyes darting, clutching her purse like it held answers. She approached Meredith fast, hissing something the mic couldn't catch. Meredith's response was visible even from the grainy footage, laughter. That same, mocking laugh she always gave when she thought she was smarter than the problem. But her smile didn't last long. June must have handed her one of the letters, maybe the notice of frozen assets, maybe the IRS audit paperwork, or the lawsuit filing from Miles's office. Because the moment she opened that envelope, Meredith's face dropped like a curtain. And then came the real performance. She fumbled for her phone. Dialed, likely her bank. Waited. Frowned. Dialed again. The more she tapped, the more frantic she became. Then her shoulders slumped. Cards declined. Accounts frozen. Reality, finally clawing its way through the fog of her delusion. June started crying. Not sobbing, more like the kind of desperate, quiet tears that come when the truth has hit you too hard, too late. She reached out, probably trying to comfort Meredith. But Meredith shoved her hand away, her mouth twisted in rage. That's when her phone buzzed again. And this time, she didn't even need to answer. Her eyes scanned the screen, widened, then darted toward the house. She screamed, loud, wordless, and wild. Slammed her hand against the gate. Kicked it once, hard enough to rattle the panel. The scream cut into something primal, like watching a queen realize her throne was made of sand. She turned, stormed to her SUV, and drove off without another word. The moment her taillights disappeared, I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. That was it. The fall had begun. Not with handcuffs. Not with sirens. Not yet. But with a locked gate and a buzz in her pocket telling her that her empire was paper and the match had already been lit. I poured myself a glass of water and stepped out onto the fire escape. Below me, the streets of Redbridge buzzed with traffic and life. Unbothered. Free. My apartment wasn't fancy, bare walls, steel frame bed, no porch swing or garden, but it was mine. No forged documents, no stolen money, no strings from anyone pretending to love me while pulling everything out from under me. She thought I'd be watching from a ditch. She didn't know I'd be watching from higher ground. It was around 10 a.m. when my phone rang. I was standing by the kitchen window of my apartment, stirring instant coffee with a plastic spoon, watching steam rise in curls against the glass. I almost didn't answer when I saw the name on the screen. Mom. It stared back at me like a ghost, like a memory of someone I used to know. For a moment, I just stood there, letting it ring, my thumb hovering over the green button. Part of me wanted to reject it. Let her feel what I'd been feeling, silence, distance, unanswered questions. But curiosity won out. I answered. Caleb, she breathed, her voice small, fragile, like she'd been crying. I didn't say anything. Please, she continued, don't hang up. I need to talk to you. The coffee sat untouched in my hand. You made your choice, I said flatly. She sighed like the weight of her own words was crushing her. We didn't know she'd take it that far. I never thought she'd sell the house your house. No, you just signed everything over to her, I said. You co-signed the mortgage. You gave her access. You handed her the tools, and now you want to play innocent. She told me it was just to restructure things, she said quickly. To lower your payments while you were gone. She said it was a way to help you. I laughed, bitter and low. Help me? By erasing me from my own deed? By letting her forge my signature and steal $500,000 out from under me? I didn't know she was doing that, she cried. I swear, Caleb, I didn't know about the forgery or the sale until after it was done. And when I found out, I panicked. I didn't know what to do. You could have called me, I said. You could have told me, warned me, but you didn't. Silence. She's broke, Caleb, she whispered. Everything's gone. They've frozen her accounts, the IRS is hounding her, and she can't even get into the house. She's staying in some dingy motel off the highway. I tried to lend her money and my card got declined too. They're investigating everything connected to her, including me. I stared at the mug in my hand, watching the steam curl and vanish. She used you, just like she used me. She's still my wife, she said, her voice wobbling. And I'm your son. The silence that followed was so thick I could feel it pressing against my chest. She didn't respond, didn't apologize, didn't offer some heartfelt revelation to make the years of betrayal make sense. Just let that ugly truth hang there between us, exposed and undeniable. I was trying to protect you, she finally said, but the words sounded hollow, rehearsed. No, I said, quieter now. You were trying to protect her. I thought you needed to grow up, she said suddenly, her tone sharpening. You clung to that house like it was everything. I thought if we pushed you a little, made you face the real world, maybe you'd start living instead of just working all the time. I closed my eyes. So the plan was to steal from me? Gaslight me into thinking it was for my own good. I didn't want it to happen like this. But you let it, I said. You let her take everything from me. And now that it's falling apart, you want sympathy? I just want my son back, she whispered. Please, Caleb. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, trying to anchor myself in something solid. But all I heard was desperation. Not regret. Not accountability. Just the sound of someone whose safety net had snapped and was now scrambling to cling to whatever was still standing. You made a choice, I said, my voice steady. And now you're living with it. Caleb, don't do this. She's not well. She's scared. I'm scared. You don't have to cut us off. But I already have, I said quietly. I ended the call without another word and set the phone down on the counter like it weighed 1,000 pounds. My hands were shaking, but not from sadness. From clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. There was no family left. No bond to salvage. Just two people, my mother and her wife, who looked at me not as someone to love, but as a resource to mine. And now that their gold vein had dried up, they were knocking at the walls like maybe something valuable was still hidden underneath. I poured the cold coffee down the sink. That night, I walked to the edge of Redbridge and watched the construction lights flicker across the skyline. I used to dream of building something bigger than myself, monuments of steel and glass that would outlast betrayal. But standing there, I realized something. It wasn't about building something that lasted. It was about knowing when to walk away from what had already crumbled. And I had finally walked away for good. The knock came just after midnight. I was awake, had been for hours. My apartment was silent except for the low hum of the city outside my window and the occasional creak from the heater kicking on. I sat at the edge of my bed, laptop still open, a spreadsheet glowing dimly on the screen. Miles had just sent over another update. Meredith's offshore transfers were now under investigation by the Department of Justice. It was all moving fast. Too fast for her to catch her breath, which is probably why she was here. The knock was soft at first, almost hesitant. I froze. My mind didn't want to believe it at first. This place wasn't exactly listed in any directory. I hadn't even shared the address with most people in my life. But Meredith? She always had ways. Connections. Contacts buried in the walls of every luxury and legal system she'd ever exploited. Another knock. Louder now. More urgent. I stood and crossed the floor in silence, heart pounding, not out of fear, but disbelief. A part of me thought maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe I was just too deep into the files and court documents and invoices to recognize fatigue. But when I reached the door and peered through the peephole, the truth hit me like a sucker punch to the ribs. It was her. Meredith Voss, standing outside my door, looking nothing like the woman who once ruled her world from behind a champagne glass. Her hair was tangled and wet. Her lipstick was smudged like she'd been crying or drinking or both. She wore a designer coat, but it was stained at the hem and hung crooked on her shoulders. Her shoes were muddy. She looked like she'd walked halfway across the city or been dragged through it. I didn't open the door. She knocked again. Caleb, she called, her voice shaky but still layered with that old, insufferable entitlement. It's me. Please. Just open the door. I folded my arms and leaned against the frame, saying nothing. I need a place to stay, she said. Just for a night. I've got nowhere else to go. They froze everything. My cards, my accounts. Her voice cracked, then caught again like she was still trying to keep some last shred of dignity intact. I didn't know it would all come down like this. I almost laughed. Didn't know? She had spent years playing puppeteer, pulling strings on everyone around her, including my mother, including me, and now she wanted sanctuary from the storm she built? No. I finally spoke, voice low and firm through the door. You need to leave. There was a pause. Caleb, please. I'm not asking you for anything permanent. Just a warm place to sleep. I haven't eaten all day. I can't get a hotel. No one will answer my calls. Not even your mother. She's not my anything anymore, I said. Caleb, she dropped her head against the door with a dull thud. You don't understand what it's like to lose everything overnight. You're wrong, I replied. I do. I lived it. And you watched it happen with a smile. She slid down until she was sitting on the ground, right there in the hallway. I could hear the fabric of her coat scrape the cheap tile as she exhaled a jagged breath. I made mistakes, okay? But it wasn't all evil. I didn't mean for it to go this far. You stole my house, I said. You forged my name. You emptied my account and used it to buy yourself a vacation across Europe. I thought you'd bounce back, she mumbled. You're strong. You always were. I thought maybe this would push you, motivate you. I didn't think you'd burn me to the ground. My jaw tightened. That's because you never imagined a version of this where you didn't win. She stood suddenly and pounded on the door again, this time louder. I made you, she hissed, the old venom creeping back into her voice. You think your little lawsuit matters? You think you're the first person to come after me? I survived worse. You'll see. That's when I called the police. I didn't threaten. I didn't yell. I simply picked up my phone, dialed, and calmly gave them my name, address, and a description of the woman currently trespassing and behaving aggressively at my door. When I hung up, I said, loud enough for her to hear, you need to leave. The police are on their way. Her fist hit the door one more time. Then again. Then she screamed, a raw, guttural sound that echoed down the hallway and probably woke half the building. You think this is over? You think you're the hero? You're nothing. You're a nobody without that house, and I gave you everything you had. I said nothing. I just stood still, letting her rage run dry. Moments later, I heard the distant wail of sirens. Meredith heard it too. There was a beat of silence. Then the sound of hurried footsteps. Running. By the time the cops arrived, she was gone. The only trace of her was a muddy footprint on the hallway floor and a sour note in the air, like expensive perfume masking rot. I gave my statement. They took notes. Promised to add the incident to the growing file on her. And when they left, I closed the door quietly behind them and stood there in the dark, leaning against the wood like it was the only thing holding me up. It was over for her. She had come to my door thinking I'd still be the old Caleb, the one who apologized, who made space for betrayal, who wanted to keep the peace. But that man was gone. And I wasn't just standing, I was fortified. The news broke the next morning. I was sipping my coffee in the kitchen, the cheap kind from the corner store downstairs, when the headline slid across my phone screen. Local socialite arrested at Valenport Airport for fraud, tax evasion. Beneath it, a photo of Meredith, hair a mess, coat wrinkled, face bare of makeup for the first time I'd ever seen. No filters. No edits. Just her, stunned and cornered, caught mid-step in front of a TSA checkpoint, handcuffed, surrounded by agents. I sat back slowly, letting it sink in. She'd been trying to flee to Lisbon on a flagged passport. Thought she could outrun it all, me, the lawsuits, the audits, the frozen accounts, the DOJ investigation. But when your entire empire is built on lies, it doesn't take much for the weight of it to collapse. A few hours later, Miles called. They booked her on mortgage fraud, tax evasion, and wire fraud. There'll be more. Federal charges are stacking like dominoes. In Lisbon? I asked. Didn't even make it past customs, he said. The feds were waiting for her. They'd flagged her flight and were watching the terminal. She didn't stand a chance. I leaned my head back against the wall, a strange calm flooding my body. It's done then. Miles paused. No, Caleb. It's just beginning for her. He was right. The civil suit we filed had already made its way through the court system with terrifying speed, thanks to the evidence Reed compiled and the testimony I gave. The judge ruled in our favor without hesitation. Meredith had been ordered to repay every dollar from the house sale, plus damages. Nearly $600,000. Of course, there wasn't much to recover anymore. She'd blown most of it in Italy and France on silk pillows, wine cellars, spa weekends. What she had left was locked up in overseas accounts that now belonged to the government. And as for my house? The sale had been reversed. Legally, the property was mine again, under my name, free and clear. But I didn't go back. I couldn't. The walls still echoed with betrayal, and no amount of restoration could fix that. It had become a monument to what I'd lost, to who I used to be. I sold it. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I wanted a clean break. I used the funds to pay legal fees, rebuild my savings, and finally breathe. The rest I invested into something new, something I could shape with my own hands. I bought a loft in Redbridge, a stripped-down, open-frame space in a converted warehouse with high ceilings, exposed brick, and beams of real oak. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't dressed up. But it was mine. No co-signers. No shared title. No whispers behind my back. I designed every corner, built shelves by hand, wired the lighting myself, even poured concrete countertops. I needed something solid. Something real. Something that didn't remind me of anyone but me. I slept better there than I had in years. The last time I saw my mother was during the court hearing. She didn't speak to me. Just sat quietly on the bench, small and pale, watching the consequences unfold like a woman realizing she'd gambled her entire life on the wrong horse. She didn't try to defend Meredith. Not anymore. Her face said it all. She knew. She knew what she'd chosen, what she'd sacrificed. I left the courtroom without a word. Weeks passed. Then a month. Then two. Meredith's trial was underway by then. Plea deals were being tossed around like confetti, but the prosecutors weren't playing nice. Too many victims. Too many forged documents, falsified returns, shell accounts. Every stone we turned over revealed another scam. I never visited her in jail. Never wrote. Never called. But I did read the reports. She was being held at a federal detention center outside Valenport. Minimum security, but no spa robes or velvet lounges there. Just bunk beds and routine checks and time alone with the silence she'd run from all her life. I liked imagining her pacing the concrete floor, cold metal beneath her designer shoes, wondering where it all went wrong. Wondering how the boy she once dismissed as a soft, overly attached step it had grown into the man who took everything back, and then some. Miles called again last week. Settlements finalized. You're officially whole. Every cent accounted for. With interest. Good, I said. You still want to pursue the asset seizures overseas? No, I replied. Let the feds handle it. I got what mattered. I stood on my balcony that night, watching the city breathe beneath me. The skyline looked different now, not just because of the structures I'd helped build, but because of who I'd become. I wasn't the man Meredith left behind. I wasn't the son June had overlooked. I wasn't the passive observer in my own life. I was the storm. And when it hit, it swept away everything false, everything weak, everything built on someone else's idea of who I should be. Now, all that remained was me, standing tall. On concrete I poured with my own hands. And somewhere across town, Meredith was staring at gray walls, tasting the bitterness of a life built on theft, wondering how she'd lost everything so fast. She hadn't lost it fast, though. She'd lost it the moment she underestimated me.